Hello and welcome to the Teaching Transformations podcast, a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I'm your host, Jack Swan. In this podcast, we interview lecturers and course leaders and ask them how they've managed to embed sustainability into their course and their teaching. Katja is a Principal Lecturer and Deputy Director of Policing at the School of Law, Policing and Social Sciences. Her teaching and research areas are interdisciplinary, and she teaches across policing, criminology and criminal psychology subjects. Katja is particularly interested in the crimes of the powerful, the overlaps between social and environmental injustices, and the climate change and crime/harm nexus. As always, I asked Katja to give us an introduction to how sustainability is connected with ideas approached in criminology. So Katja, thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have you here. You're teaching in a variety of different areas around policing and criminology and found some really interesting ways that sustainability intersects with those issues and done a bit of the course design for all of that yourself. So can you give us a bit of an overview of how you found these themes embedded throughout the criminology and policing you've taught?
Yeah. I think broadly speaking, you don't necessarily think about the intersections in that way. In fact, a lot of our students and often practitioners and staff even think about, well, I got into criminology, justice, policing to help people. That's their starting point, right? And it's okay, like, well, environment is all nice, but why do I need to go about environment? I want to help people. So getting everyone a kind of understanding the intersection of the two, how well-being in sort of broadest sense of people actually depends on the well-being of the environment and how they intersect in terms of things like injustices, experience. So that's been kind of like the broad concept of that, if you like. I can then talk about a couple of examples, more specific ones. So several years ago, a colleague and I, who's no longer here at the university, we designed a module we called Criminology for a Just Society. And we designed that together with students who then on the following year took that module. So it was a very designed module as well with a small group of students. And we wanted there to embed justice and sustainability in the broadest sense. We talk about social justice, environmental, economic and cultural one in thinking of that from through the criminological lens. And that involved some volunteering placements as well as kind of content around that. So that did challenge our students in a quite a positive way, and the feedback that we got on that was really, really interesting. It was transformational for some of the students in terms of how to approach things. I've then also done some extracurricular bits. We did a sort of extracurricular project related to the Whole Earth exhibition. That was at the university quite a few years ago, where again we did it with our students in criminology, policing, forensic investigation, etc. Just about their reactions to the exhibition, which was a lot of different photographs from across the world and sort of linked into the Sustainable Development Goals as well, and started thinking about the local global connections. And that's often another kind of link. It's challenging but rewarding to get our students over is the fact that whatever happens across the globe will inevitably have an impact on the local communities. And that's really interesting with our policing students as well, because they think, well, why do I need to care about drought in Africa or conflict in somewhere else, because I'm going to be serving in Dover local communities. And then you start unpacking that and going, okay, well, what does that mean to movement of people when people are displaced and if they head elsewhere? And then does that cause some conflicts in the local communities, etc.? So there are ways of teasing that out.
That's really interesting. You're absolutely right. Lovely using the example of Dover as well, because, you know, that's the front line of the very live issue we have with, you know, people crossing the channel at the minute, and a really clear way of saying what's going on in another part of the world is contributing to people becoming, you know, climate refugees and seeking coming to the UK, and then that obviously having a massive impact on the political discussion here right now. I'm interested in criminology in a just world as you designed it, and how you went about implementing that and bringing these ideas together. Obviously, sustainability, like you're saying, it's bringing in all sorts of different things, not just the climate, not just green issues, not just carbon footprinting, but how that ties in with keeping these things going on a social basis, on a justice basis, and how that connects together. What were the challenges you faced in designing that module? Were there any particular barriers you found you had to overcome? And particularly with the co-design as well. I'm keen to hear what your experience was of that and how clearly it sounds like it paid off, how that came together so well.
Yeah. It required buy-in from the students. So we were very lucky at that point that we had a group of enthusiastic students. My colleague and I had a sort of good relationship with anyway. So when we pitched this idea to them, they were kind of on board of taking the module as well. We were also very lucky. We were supported by the Central Universities from the Sustainability Fund at that point for that, Futures Fund, I think it was called. So we got some financial support for that, which helped us to, get lunch for our students for design days and do short trips around the kind of locality and those sort of things as well. I think when you talked about criminology in just world and the sort of, I guess, conceptual links, it's perhaps worth understanding that within criminology, criminal justice, there are existing theoretical and conceptual links. So, for example, green criminology is a massively increasing area where there is basically focus on environmental harms in the broadest sense. And there is also links there around when we talk about semiology, which kind of focuses more on harms rather than crime. So this idea that if we look at sort of harms in society, we cannot just focus on things that are strictly speaking illegal, right? Because what is illegal depends on the time and the locality. Things that are legal now were illegal in the past and vice versa. So getting people over that sort of, is it a crime or not, to think about actually, is this behavior harmful? And what can we then lessen the impact of that behavior is another one of those kind of, I guess, sort of almost a threshold concept idea when we get to thinking. So there's a kind of, I guess, a theoretical basis within criminology, criminal justice of thinking about these broader issues. And from my perspective, I think when we think about this shift towards criminalizing certain actions, we've seen some very interesting examples of that in the UK at the moment, things like the protest, etc., right? But there is also a social tipping point going in other way in terms of increasing public censure of behaviors that contribute to climate change. And I don't mean whether or not you eating a steak or not, I'm talking about behaviors of fossil fuel industry and governments, right? So when we get the societal tipping point around what sort of behaviors are considered acceptable or not acceptable, that's where we slowly then eventually start to see a shifting in laws. Yeah. So we've seen this in other areas already. So we have existing examples of this. So from my perspective, I think that might be the direction we're going. We've already seen a massive increase in litigation against fossil fuel companies. We saw the case from the European Court of Human Rights against the Swiss government, etc. So the signs are there.
It sounds quite interesting. You've covered a couple of themes there. One that I was quite intrigued by is this, like you say, the sort of threshold concept and how the students, you're coming in as the academic with a knowledge of where they're going to struggle with this, where they need to be pushed that little bit further, which sounds quite reasonable because like you describe, again, the idea of green policing sounds two very separate concepts mashed together there. So it sounds like in course design, having an awareness of where students are going to struggle to make those mental bridges is very, very important. And then you've also said as well, and the other quite practical challenge that you found the solutions to of getting the funding, getting the support, using those existing positive relationships to bring the students with you on that journey of co-design. It sounds very successful. What subsequent student response been? If I'm not leading the question by saying it sounds successful.
That's really interesting because yes, it was, but that module only ran 2 or 3 times. Okay. So largely what was challenging about then is that it didn't recruit a lot because there was a placement element of it and students find that quite challenging. And then of course we had COVID years, etc. So that was
Can you go
additional
into
challenge in that.
why the placement part was a challenge?
I think one of those things, we call it a placement, but actually it's a work experience or a volunteering experience that students have to source themselves, because to guarantee a placement, there are various processes and systems in place, etc. And that's very difficult to do in any area. And students found that potentially an additional burden, even though theoretically many of them found sort of understood the benefits of something like that. And the students who went through it and had those experiences massively kind of felt it was beneficial, and they learned a lot, and it was useful for their CVs and all those sort of kind of practical benefits. But you also have to understand the additional burden it puts on students in terms of their time. Currently, certainly, probably 90% of the students I teach work part-time, some almost practically full-time hours, just to basically survive. So I can understand how practically this idea that you'd have to fit in, even if it's sort of 40 hours over a semester or whatever, can be off-putting and just too challenging for some of our students. So I think that was part of the reason there, absolutely.
I think that's really helpful feedback to have, actually, because no doubt the point of this podcast is to give guidance to colleagues who are looking at how they can embed sustainability. And no doubt some people will be thinking, well, placement, that sounds logical. And other people we've spoken to have said there's a value. And in fact, where we want to go next is by building relationships with stakeholders, with employers. And what you're telling us is very valuable, but the sticking point is helping to arrange that, finding the time for the students, whether that's them arranging it themselves or participating. So by all means, a useful thing to do, but be aware of it as a challenge, as a point of
And I think that sort of goes beyond, and the challenge, I guess, is that with these sort of modules that look at something like sustainability embed in it, they often are a bit different. They're often sort of require doing something more than showing up to a lecture and listening for 2 hours, right? And I don't mean that our students don't want to do that, don't want to do something else, because I think they do. It's just that the practical challenges are often there in terms of actually finding, this week we're actually having a half a day trip to Margate to look at coastal communities or whatever. That can be beyond kind of capacity for some of our students in terms of time, because they've got caring responsibilities, or they just can't, they can, come to a 2-hour lecture, but they can't take 6 hours of their day because they got a shift at Tesco, without which they don't eat. So I think there's sort of those sort of things. So thinking more creatively around how you approach that and provide those sort of experiences within the time and capacity students have at their use.
And certainly I can say this as a trainee teacher, coming up with those creative solutions and planning them can be some of the most taxing stuff we have to do as educators. Have you found any creative solutions to them, or are there any that are in the back of your mind that perhaps you'd like to experiment with if you had the opportunity to design this kind of course in the future?
I think there's more room. I think with the enhancing in kind of technology enabled everything that came with the pandemic, there's much more willingness and skills across the board to embed something that is students doing a podcast, for example, or any kind of perhaps digital output around those sort of things. I think there's also an increasing opportunities to look at what is it that the students can do in-house at university on campus if we can't or they can't kind of go outside the campus for these sort of positions. Then we could look at sort of where students can volunteer in-house as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're a bunch of students in a podcast studio right now. Could it be rather than going out to the experts, they're bringing them in to have that kind of conversation and use that as an artifact to be assessed on? That could be really exciting. That's really interesting. Are there any other areas looking at the embedding of sustainability or the interweaving of it in the criminology and policing areas, or just pedagogy in general, that you think there are areas for improvement or next steps that you'd like to see happen?
It's really interesting because sustainability in its broadest sense, being kind of climate literate in some ways and all of that, you can see it embedded at strategic level. So where, for example, when you look at things like QIA benchmark statements, when you look at professional standards and regulatory body kind of guidance and so on and so forth, you see it there. you don't always see that filter down to kind of tactical or operational activity, whether that's in education or whether that's in practice within the criminal justice system. And we saw that when a colleague and I done some research on planning and preparation the police have or don't have when it comes to climate emergency and things that will come with that. So I think there's work to be done about embedding things in practice rather than just it says so somewhere in top level. The other thing I don't think is necessarily talked about enough is issues around focus on power. So we often talk about climate change, for example, as something that's criminogenic, that will increase people's risk of either being involved in offending behaviors like survival crimes or being increased risk of exploitation and increase of their vulnerability for various reasons. Resource scarcity, social disorganizations, etc., etc. What I don't think we still don't talk enough about is about the behaviors that are harmful, whether they're criminal or not, that directly contribute to things like climate change or environmental degradation overall. And that's not unusual. So if you look at crimes that are making the headlines, right, it's street crimes, violent crimes, etc. Obviously important we address those, but not the crimes and the harms caused by those in power. So if we look at the levels of harms in terms of financial costs to the society or even sort of health costs to society, it's going to be much higher from the fossil fuel industry continuing to do what it does, corporations avoiding their environmental regulations, their health and safety regulations, their taxes, etc., etc. So I think there's kind of that kind of critical approach that it's not missing from criminology as a kind of discipline. It's definitely talked about, but when you move on to the practical side of that in terms of criminal justice priorities, what is it the police prioritize, is not going to be any of that, because the government is not prioritizing any of that, because the government often has a vested interest in not prioritizing that, is what I would say.
What you're discussing is very interesting, and it touches on themes that we've seen either side of with various lecturers who've come on and spoken to us. We've had some, for example, say in film, who say, well, there's an industry level accreditation, there's the Albert scheme. It's in our interest to teach our students towards that because they're thinking about carbon footprinting there. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us as educators to prepare them for that. We've had others, they haven't said as much in the podcast, although separately, which is that, for example, the organisation that they're working towards and that validates the course doesn't, or isn't, to be fair, isn't yet thinking about how it can embed sustainability. Perhaps there's conversations going on, they may come into fruition in 2 or 3 years' time, but until then, there is no validatory criteria or impetus to work towards that. And what you're describing is very much that kind of thing, which is from a power perspective, from a criticality perspective, but also from a purely practical perspective of we've got X amount of time to teach towards this criteria. It's not currently in there, so it remains discretionary for lecturers, for course directors to find the opportunities for that, or like you described, the extracurricular opportunities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that means that there is very variable opportunities students get for something, just often depending on the institution and people they might have in the classroom, etc. But I guess there's an ethical aspect to it to me, because so having spoken with people who want to go into criminal justice practice or who already are practitioners in the criminal justice system, people often kind of go into those sort of roles because they want to help others, right? So that's the main motivator in some way, kind of thing. So they're starting from a very ethical kind of stance. What's really challenging is when things that they are asked to do then challenge their own ethics, okay? So what happens when those police officers are asked to clear out the community leaders and the religious leaders and the grandmothers and grandfathers who are protesting, who are not your usual suspects in any way or shape or form, and they've been asked to cart them off the
Thanks again to Katja Halenberg for sharing with us what she and her colleagues have been doing to embed sustainability within the teaching of policing and criminology. Thanks for joining us on the Teaching Transformations podcast. The podcast is a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I've been your host, Jack Swan. Production and video editing is handled by Harry Cooper. The video version of the podcast was recorded by Harry King and Drew Shelley-Winfield. Audio design and editing is managed by Matt Crawley. Additional equipment and recording space was organised by James Sanford and Kiara Hewer. Distribution and promotion is organised by Bethany Clemson. Special thanks go to Andrew Lombard and Felicity Brambling-Wells for all their support in helping us put together this Teaching Transformations podcast.